Um, Allow me to read for you a few verses from Judges chapter 18. In those days, there was no king in Israel. And in those days, the tribe of the Danites, were seeking an inheritance for itself to dwell in. For until that day, their inheritance among the tribes of Israel had not fallen to them. So the children of Dan sent 5 men out of their family from their territory, men of valor from Zorah and Eshtaol, to spy out the land and search it. They said to them, "Go search the land." So they went to the mountains of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, and lodged there. While they were at the house of Micah, they recognized the voice of the young Levite, who turned aside and said, They turned aside to him and said to him, "Who brought you here? What are you doing in this place? What do you have here?" And he said to them, "Thus and so Micah did for me. He has hired me and I have become his priest." So they said to him, "Please inquire of God, that we may know whether the journey on which we go will be prosperous." And the priest said to them, "Go in peace. The presence of the Lord be with you on your journey." So the 5 men departed and went to Laish. They saw the people who were there, how they dwelt safely in the manner of the Sidonians, quiet and secure. There were no rulers in the land who might put them to shame for anything. They were far from the Sidonians, and they had no ties with anyone. Then the spies came back to their brethren at Zorah and Eshtaol, and the brethren said to them, "What is your report?" And they said to them, "Arise, let us go up against them, for we have seen the land, and indeed it is very good. Will you do nothing? Do not hesitate to go and enter the land. When you go, you will come to a secure people and a large land, for God had given it into our hands, a place where there is no lack or anything that is on the earth." In Judges chapter 18, the curtains have been lifted with the news of the tribe of Dan looking for a place to settle. If you remember, when Israel first conquered Canaan, the Danites were commanded to occupy the region between Ephraim and Judah. They did not take control of the territory, and the tribes either side of them were much stronger, so they decided to relocate. So God gave them a land initially, which they chose not to occupy due to the predicament. In fact, if you read Judges chapter 1, verse 34 and 35, it said the Amorites pressed the people of Dan back into the hill, for they did not allow them to come to the plain. But remember, it was God who told Joshua how to divide the land. But in Judges chapter 1, I'm just taking you back. The people of Dan chose to be suppressed by the Amorites. Now they want to to go up and occupy the land when they thought they were ready. If you remember carefully, Dan occupied a very small area in the region of Zorah, where the activities of Samson, in fact, when you read Judges chapter 13, the Manoah and his wife, they were from the tribe of Dan, living in a very small territory. Now they thought it is time for them to go up and occupy the land. When God gave them the land in the first place, and they failed to occupy the land because they chose to listen, they chose to be intimidated by the opponents who were larger than them, greater than them. You see, folks, it's interesting that in Judges chapter 18, the tribe of Dan now thinks that this is their time to go forward. They are, as it were, recalling the incident of Numbers chapter 13, when God sent the spies to spy out the land of Canaan. The only difference now is that they are doing it on their own terms. You see, folks, when God gives you something to do, or God assigns you something to do, it is not because you are capable. When God gives you an assignment, it is not because you are able. God asks you to do what you can do because He is able to accomplish His will through you. Dan was small, but God was strong. God knew that Dan was no match for the Ammonites and the Amorites. God knew that. But if God says, occupy the land, it doesn't matter how strong the opponent seems. You must trust God and go forward. The people of Dan, they were intimidated by the enemy. I want to say to someone this morning, never be intimidated by the forces you face. Never be intimidated by the fight you are in. Never be intimidated by your opposition, because if God is on your side, though you may be small, though you may be in the minority, the tribe of Dan should have understood that it was God who gave them the land. It was God who said to them, I'm going to plant you in Canaan. And thus, they should have, and they ought to have, occupied the land that God has given to them. A lot of us, we have not gone up and occupied the territory that God has given to us. God has given you, God has given us territory to occupy, which is not yet occupied because of our lack of faith. God has given us the land, but we are intimidated, we are scared, and we are hoping that we will occupy the land on our territory. So now, Dan, the tribe of Dan, is sending out 5 scouts. Remember, Joshua sent out 12. The tribe of Dan is sending out 5. But what is interesting, the Bible said in verse 1, there was no king in the land. So who is giving direction? Who is giving direction? You see, the fact that there is no king in the land, it means there is no voice. God spoke through the king. The king was not just a political ruler. The king was a theocratic ruler. He was the voice of God to the people. And when there is no king in the land, it means that everyone does as they wish. You know, the thing is, folks, these 5 men, I don't know who sent them out, but we know that it was not God. They decided that now is the time that we should go and occupy the land. What is interesting here is that Dan, the tribe of Dan, is choosing to attempt an expedition that God did not give them permission to do. You know, how many times have we tried to do things without getting a clear direction from God? Now, folks, we are living in an era today where everyone claims that they are hearing the voice of God. Now, I always say this. It is not our business to tell people this is not the voice of God. But however, if something is not the voice of God, or if something is not in the will of God, it won't last. If something is not given by God, if God's blessings is not on something, it won't last. The tribe of Dan, they set out an expedition to discover their land. And when you do not start with God, you see, if you start on the wrong foot, you cannot end up on the right foot. When you don't start with God, you are you are starting dangerously. It is imperative before you begin any exploit in your life, any adventure, any major initiative, begin with God. These 5 spies set out without any spiritual, any direction from God. They set out on an expedition that was solely their doing. It was solely their making. How many of us make major decisions in life without God and we still claim it is God? How many times have we entered into partnerships, into relationships, into business transactions? How many times have we done major investment without God, but we claim it was God? The tribe of Dan, they are now doing a major expedition. They are going back to claim the land that they forfeited. And they are hoping they have the blessings of God. So interestingly, the 5 spies, as they went out on the expedition, the Bible said that they ended up in the house of Micah. Remember that same Micah we met in Judges chapter 17? You know, the same Micah who took upon himself to well, if you remember that Micah who stole from his mother, by the way, let me begin, right? The mother was saving some money from him, and he stole from his very mother. Then that same Micah, he took one of his sons and made him priest. God did not give him that authority. Then he hired a priest from Bethlehem that was out of work. That same Micah, now the tribe of Dan, is in the house of Micah. What are they doing there? You know, the Bible is quite interesting, but they ended up in the house of Micah. And the Bible said that when they got to the house of Micah, they lodged there. And while there, they recognized a familiar voice. They recognized a voice that they heard before. And so they asked him What are you doing here? He told them that Micah hired him as his personal priest. And they thought, wow, this is an opportunity for us to seek some guidance from God. Now, this is interesting. The tribe started out, these 5 men started out their journey without God. Halfway in the journey, they bumped into a priest who, by the way, was simply, he was a priest that was looking for work, got hired by Micah. So that is one of those priests who you know are in the priesthood for the money. But the tribe of Dan wanted a priest anyhow. They didn't care whether that priest had the approval of God. So they landed a priest who was in the house of Micah, and then it dawned on them, we did not ask God's direction. So then they asked Micah's priest in verse 5 of Judges chapter 18, inquire of God for us, that we may know whether the journey on which we are setting out. Well, you're already on the journey. You know, sometimes I wonder why some people take God for a puppy show. Or you already on the journey and you're asking God if you should go on the journey. You know, sometimes we do that. We already doing what we're doing, but we still praying. You already make up your mind, but you're asking God. If you want God's direction, ask him at the beginning. Don't ask him halfway through when you can't turn back. Why is it we sometimes pray when you already know what you're doing? Why pray that God give you wisdom when you already, you already have in your mind what you want to do? Why pray that God give you a wife when you already engaged the wife? I mean, the person you're going to marry. Why ask God for his opinion when you've already made up your decision? So these 5 spies wanted God's opinion, but they wanted God to rubber stamp their decision. They already made up their mind. And a lot of us treat prayer as a stamp. We are praying, but we've already made up our mind. You are asking God to help you, but you know already that your mind is made up. So why pray when your mind is made up? You are taking God for a ride now. These 5 spies remind us of people who use God conveniently. You see, we know what we want, we're doing what we want, but we just wanted to have the blessings of God. These 5 spies, they were not prepared to turn back. Because if you are truly listening to God's voice, you should be prepared to turn back. If God says you're going in the wrong direction, you should be prepared to turn back. But no matter what God said to them, they would still go forward because they were bent on getting a new territory. Some of us, we are praying, but no matter what God says, we're still doing what we want. We have to stop that. We have to stop that. If you are not prepared to listen to God's voice, then why ask his opinion? In other words, if I'm praying to God, I should be willing to turn from my wicked ways. I should be prepared to recant my behavior, to change my attitudes. That's why some people, the more they pray, the same they stay. You know, they're praying, and that's because we are praying, but we already have our minds made up. Prayer can only change us if we are willing. But here's the problem here in this text. They inquired of the priest who, by the way, was a fly-by-night priest. That priest, not all priests, not all people that call themselves priests praise, that priest here, we've never heard yet where the priest in Micah's house went to God and asked God anything. This is a priest who was looking for a work and got a job with Micah. So he doesn't pray at all. That priest is a priest that has a degree in theology. And having a degree in theology, people may call you pastor. That doesn't make you a pastor. You got to be connected to God. And anyone can go to school and study theology and have a degree and call themselves a pastor. But having the word pastor in front of your name does not mean you are connected to God. And here you have a priest who was called a priest but not connected to God. So this priest, and let me show you why we can say he was not connected to God. The 5 spies came to him, and the spies said to him in verse 5, "Inquire of the Lord whether we should go on the journey on which we will be prosperous." So they've already decided that they want to be prosperous, but they are going to God. Well, listen to my friend the priest now. Verse 6. And the priest said to them, the priest said to them, no, my partner didn't go to God, The priest said to them, "Go in peace, the presence of the Lord." If this priest was he would have said, "Let me go and inquire of the Lord." You don't know these people from Adam. You just meet the people. They brought a request to you and you're giving them an answer. Let me tell you something, brethren. When people come to you and ask you for an answer, before you open your mouth, go to God. Go to God. Not every time somebody asks you what you think, you should tell them what you think. Sometimes we are too quick to tell people what we are thinking. Sometimes people come to you and say, "What are you thinking?" Tell them, "Hold a minute, let me go to God. Let me go to God. I don't want to just tell you what I'm thinking. Let me go to God." Well, this priest, who we have never ever heard him seeking God, he's opening his mouth to tell them, "Go in peace." And not only that, he's lying on the Lord. He's saying, "The presence of the Lord be with you on your journey." Did God tell him that? No. So, brethren, this morning, let me end on this point here. I'm going to continue on that next week. We have always had, in the Bible, we've always had people who hide behind the garb of religiosity. Not everyone who is saying, "Lord, Lord," is of God. In fact, the Bible said not all those who said, "Lord, Lord," will enter the kingdom. Not because some people praying and calling on God's name, they are seeking God. Not every religious person is spiritual. And it is not just today. In the Bible, you had people saying, "The Lord said," but it's not the Lord. It is their own opinion. Not everyone who tells you, "God tells me," is God telling them. So don't be blown away by people telling you God says. You must have your own relationship with God and know when God is speaking. Here is it. This priest who never spoke to God is telling them, "The Lord said." So a lot of us like to use the word "the Lord said to me" to hide behind it, and we should stop it. If you know God didn't tell you, don't say he did. Make sure you are seeking God's voice and you are assured of his guidance. Spend time in the word and in the presence of God to know what God is saying. But don't just jump up like this priest and say, "The Lord is saying." I know we are living in a time of the priesthood of all believers where God can speak to anybody. But make sure it is the voice of God before you said, the Lord is saying to me. This priest is giving an advice on behalf of God when he has never consulted God. Today, do we still have people who are giving God's advice when we've never consulted him? And that's why it's important, brethren, to seek God. Seek God before speaking on God's behalf. May God help us this morning that we will not speak on his behalf without first seeking his permission. If I'm speaking on God's behalf, he must give me permission to say that this is God's word. If not, and we're going to see next week, that I can tell people that God says, and if God did not say it, it won't work. It won't work. So today, brethren, the question is, did God really tell you to do what you're doing? Or are you saying God tell you, and you know you did not hear his voice? If you know you haven't heard it, don't say you've heard it. Make sure that before you move forward, you've heard from God. Make sure before you open your mouth to give an advice to someone, you've heard from God. It is a very serious thing to say the Lord said. If he did not say to you, don't say he said. Make sure that we are listening to his voice. Father in heaven, this morning, help us. Help us, oh God, to listen to your voice. And if we're not hearing it, let us not say it. But if we hear it, help us to be obedient to your voice, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen.